Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Kudenchek. I'm professor of medicine in cardiology at the University of Washington. I'm a faculty member for the Resuscitation Academy and medical program director for King County Medic 1. Thanks for joining me today as we talk about CPR, what it takes to save a life. Survival after cardiac arrest is a time-dependent problem. Even if a first responder comes on scene with a defibrillator and shocks a patient out of cardiac arrest, the time from collapse to that shock determines whether that patient lives or dies. In this slide, you can see that as the bars in this graph, as the likelihood of surviving a cardiac arrest based on the time from collapse to when the first shock is administered. And notice while an early shock is highly effective for terminating ventricular fibrillation, the red line is a line of death. For every minute that passes before a shock is administered, survival falls by about 10%. Notice what happens, though, if the first responder administers CPR. That red line of death now becomes a gold line of life. It's as if CPR suspends the process of death and buys more time and makes that shock at whatever interval it's given, early, middle, or even later, more likely to save that individual's life. And that kind of CPR, or high-performance CPR, is what we want to talk about today. So let's break it down. What are the components of CPR when someone comes on scene, a first responder, and starts pressing on the chest? Let's break it down into two pieces. The first is compression piece. If you think about the chest or the thorax as a pump, when you are placing your hands on the chest and pushing down, what you're doing is increasing pressure inside the chest. That's called intrathoracic pressure. That pressure that you're generating inside the chest is what ejects blood out of the heart, out of the lungs, and out of everything that sits inside the chest. Meaning the better your compression, the better the blood flow out of the heart, the better the blood flow to the brain, to the kidneys, and every organ that's in the body. Decompression, recoil. That's when you lift your hand off the chest and allow the chest that was compressed to now re-expand to where it was before you started pressing. Now, that creates an interesting thing inside the chest. It creates a vacuum. As the chest is re-expanding, the pressure inside the chest is falling and it sucks blood back into the heart, back into the lungs, and everything that's in the chest that needs to fill with blood. Meaning the better the recoil, the stronger that vacuum inside the chest, the better the chest refills, and guess what that means? The next compression is going to have a full chest of blood to pump out to the rest of the body. So here's the challenge. How do we do that and put enough gunpowder in it to make CPR the most effective that it can possibly be, what we call high-performance CPR? Well, here are the 5 what you can call metrics that the American Heart Association recommends for what it takes to deliver effective and high-performance CPR. And they're pretty simple rules. This is not rocket science. The first is optimize your chest compression rate, meaning press the chest at 100 to 120 compressions per minute. Number 2, press deeply, at least 2 inches for every compression. Third, minimize interruptions in chest compressions, meaning keep what's called the chest compression fraction, the percentage of time you're doing CPR in someone who's pulseless, as high as you possibly can. Fourth, let that chest recoil. Don't lean on the chest, let it bounce back so it can refill the heart. And finally, control breathing and ventilation. Let's talk about each one of these in turn. First question you could ask is, where did we come up with these numbers? 100 to 120 compressions per minute, 2 inches? Did we just make them up? Is there any information, any real studies that tell us these numbers truly make a difference? Well, there are. And let me just delve into the science a little bit with you here. Here's a study of over 6,000 adults who had a cardiac arrest. And during the time that they were being resuscitated, the kind of defibrillators that were put on their chest could measure not only the rhythm that they were in, that whether it needed to be shocked or not, but could also measure the rate of compression. So you could count every compression and how frequently that was given. Now, if you did that and you asked what was the relationship between survival, the left side of the graph, and the rate at which compressions were given, you come up with the gold line that you see in this slide. And notice that at between 100 and 120 compressions per minute, survival is at its peak in these patients who got CPR. Notice also if you press less than that rate, survival falls off, and just as important, if you press faster than that rate, survival also falls off, which says that sweet window of 100 to 120 compressions per minute and staying within that range is a life-saving component of CPR. What about chest compression depth? Meaning, does it matter how deeply you press the chest as to whether it affects outcome? Well, once again, 9,000 patients who had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, who while they were getting CPR, you could monitor how deeply the chest was being pressed each time a chest compression was administered. And here's the same graph. On the left side is survival to hospital discharge, and on the bottom is the depth in inches that was administered during CPR. And notice if you look at that red line that right at around 2 inches, you have the sweet spot of maximizing survival in that group of patients. Notice something else. Drop chest compression by half an inch and survival falls by 50%. 50% for merely half an inch. So if you want an equation to think about the relationship between chest compression, depth, and survival, for every quarter inch you can increase the depth, survival improves by 5%. You save 5 more people out of 100 by just putting in that extra quarter inch. Makes a big difference. So it makes sense. Chest compression rate, chest compression depth. What about interruptions in CPR? What impact does it have when chest compressions are paused for a short period or even for a longer period during CPR? So let's look at it for a minute. In this particular diagram, you see on top chest compressions being given to the heart. And on the bottom, I'm showing you the pressure that's generated with each one of those compressions. So with CPR, you're generating a blood pressure. Remember that compression is pushing blood out of the heart, out of the chest, and creating a blood pressure. Notice on the right portion of the slide, within 3 seconds of getting your hands off the chest, pressure plummets to 0. No flow anywhere, not to the heart, not to the brain, within 3 seconds. Now I got to be honest with you. I used to think interrupt CPR for 3, 4, 5 seconds, that's like just holding your breath and you just pick up right where you left off. But here's the sad message of CPR. Once you pause CPR, you do not begin where you left off with a high pressure. You start right from the beginning, and it takes you another 30 compressions or about 16 seconds to make up for 3 or 4 seconds of a pause in CPR. What that says is that anytime you pause CPR for more than 3 or 4 seconds, it costs the patient about 20 seconds of perfusion. Now, what difference does that make to survival? In this particular graph, what you see is on the left side, survival to hospital discharge, and on the bottom, interruptions in CPR. The further you go to the right, see what happens to that green line. Survival falls from 30% to 23% to 12% and finally 0% the more interruptions there are in CPR. Those can be short interruptions, they can be long interruptions, but interrupted CPR affects survival. So we've talked about rate, we've talked about depth, and we've talked about the importance of not interrupting CPR. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when you lift your hands off the chest and you have recoil. What can we do to maximize that and to make sure we don't interfere with it? Well, let's go back to the decompression phase of CPR. What's going on at that particular time? Well, remember again, the chest is bouncing back from its original pressed configuration. And as a result, there's a vacuum that's creating inside the chest. That vacuum is refilling the heart and lungs by sucking blood back into the chest itself, meaning the better the vacuum, the better the refilling, and the more the chest is refilled, the better the next compression. Letting that chest recoil is really critical. But here's the problem. Doing CPR is hard work. You are pressing, and often what happens is we get tired, and after we press, instead of lifting our hands and allowing the chest to completely recoil, we tend to keep our hands with just a little bit of pressure on the chest, meaning we don't allow the chest to completely recoil because we're resting on it because we're tired. Now, when we do that, what are we doing? We're interfering with the vacuum that the chest is creating as a result of bouncing back. And what impact can that have on cardiac arrest outcome? Well, a study was done looking at pigs where exactly that was done. What you see in this slide is measuring the blood supply to the heart on the left side and the blood flow to the brain on the right side. And this is the measure of blood supply to the heart and to the brain during regular CPR in these pigs. Full compression, full decompression. The study then did something very interesting. They did everything the same except they didn't take their hands completely off the chest. They left in these pigs just a fraction of an inch of pressure on the chest, like you were leaning, like you were tired, and they said, what effect did that have on blood supply to the heart and blood supply to the brain? And if you look at this, you can see that the heart lost a third of its blood supply, and the brain lost half of its blood supply, simply by not letting the chest recoil to its full configuration after it was compressed. So, chest compression rate, chest compression depth, not interrupting CPR, and allowing full recoil of the chest. What about ventilation, breathing, and cardiac arrest? Let's talk about that just for a moment. First of all, the question is, does a first responder necessarily have to ventilate someone who's in cardiac arrest? And the answer is yes and no, and let me explain that to you. On the right side of this particular slide, you're seeing measures of oxygen on top and measures of carbon dioxide in the blood on the bottom. And what you can see is that the red line for oxygen and the blue line for carbon dioxide change during cardiac arrest when no ventilation is being provided. Oxygen in the red line declines over time. Carbon dioxide, the blue line, increases over time because you can't get CO2 out and you can't get oxygen in if you're not ventilating. But notice this, for the first 4 to 5 minutes after someone collapses, CO2 levels, carbon dioxide, and oxygen levels are essentially unchanged, which means for the first few minutes of cardiac arrest when someone has ventricular fibrillation, breathing doesn't matter. The problem comes after 4 or 5 minutes, particularly when you're doing CPR, that now the body needs oxygen and the body needs to get rid of CO2, and that's where ventilation comes into play. What we do with ventilation is we're blowing oxygen into the lungs and then allowing CO2, carbon dioxide, to come out of the lungs. That's important because it's providing those nutrients, oxygen, into the blood, so when we pump the chest, we're delivering not just blood without oxygen, but blood that has oxygen in it. But here's the problem when we overdo it. If you breathe too often, or you breathe too forcefully, remember what each breath does. It's putting pressure inside the chest, right? It's doing it by the air that we're pushing in. And if the heart and chest want to refill at the same time, you're fighting two battles, the vacuum and the air coming in. So we want to be cautious about how vigorously and how frequently we ventilate. If you ventilate too vigorously, you're potentially going to compromise CPR. If you don't ventilate at all, the patient's going to lose their oxygen and the ability to get rid of carbon dioxide. But what's the bottom line? Here it is. Number one, ventilation is important, but it's not the most important thing for a first responder to do in the first 4 to 5 minutes. That's where hands-only CPR works because ventilation isn't critical. Number two, after that, breathing and ventilation become important. But excessive breathing works against CPR because it works against chest refilling. Also remember, when the heart is in cardiac arrest, even with CPR, it's not a normal cardiac output. And as a result, the amount of breathing and ventilation doesn't have to be the same as in a normal breathing person. It can be less. How do we do that? Give small breaths, sufficient to see the chest rise, and you're done. You don't need to put a big cannon of air inside the chest. A small amount will do the trick. It'll get oxygen in, it'll get CO2 out, and the patient will do better as a result. So here we are, 5 metrics of high-performance CPR. Optimize chest compression rate, optimize chest compression depth, minimize interruptions in CPR, promote full chest recoil, don't lean on the chest, and control breathing and ventilation. Now I can promise you something. You do that, you do high-performance CPR, and you will maximize the success that you will have in resuscitating that patient. And the marriage between that kind of CPR and defibrillation, done as soon as you can possibly do it, will save lives. You will save lives putting that package together every time you encounter someone in cardiac arrest.